In a quiet suburban neighborhood, Laura's peaceful life was turned upside down when a mysterious neighbor, Alex, moved in next door. At first he seemed like a regular man, but strange late-night visitors and unsettling activities around his house soon made Laura question everything she thought she knew about her community. What began as a simple suspicion quickly spiraled into a terrifying discovery: a secret criminal operation led by Alex himself. As Laura's search for answers deepens, she finds herself entangled in a dangerous game that could change everything. What happens when the truth hits too close to home? Laura had always loved the quiet, peaceful life of her suburban neighborhood. The trees lined the streets, children played outside, and neighbors waved as they walked by. Everything felt safe, comfortable, and familiar. Laura had lived in the same house for over a decade, and she could always count on the stability of the community. But that all began to change when Alex moved in next door. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Alex was a man in his late 30s, tall and slender, with a serious look about him. He didn't speak much to anyone and kept to himself. He moved in on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, his belongings being carried inside by a hired moving crew. Laura, curious as any neighbor would be, noticed the man but didn't think much of it. She saw him as just another addition to the neighborhood, nothing more. Days passed, and Laura rarely saw Alex outside. He would come and go at odd hours, never staying around long enough for anyone to truly strike up a conversation. He would sometimes be seen leaving in a car, his face unreadable, his movements quick and purposeful. Other times he'd be back late at night, the headlights of his car cutting through the darkness as he parked his vehicle in the driveway and disappeared into the house. It was his behavior that slowly began to pique Laura's interest. For a man who seemed to be such a private person, Alex sure had a lot of visitors. Late at night, cars would pull up to his house, sometimes more than one in a single evening. Strangely, these cars didn't belong to any of the other neighbors. In fact, she didn't recognize the vehicles at all. The cars would park in front of his house, and figures would enter through the front door. The visitors would leave hours later, always under the cover of darkness, and always in different cars. Laura had always been a careful observer. It wasn't that she was suspicious by nature, but in the quiet rhythm of suburban life, people tended to notice when things were out of place. One evening, as she was tending to her garden, she saw two men approach Alex's house. They were dressed in dark clothes and seemed to be speaking in low voices, exchanging a few hurried words before disappearing into the house. It wasn't unusual for people to visit, but there was something off about these men. They didn't seem like typical neighbors or friends. Their hurried movements, the way they glanced over their shoulders, gave off an unsettling vibe. Laura couldn't put her finger on why, but she felt a sense of unease. She told herself that maybe it was nothing, maybe it was just her overactive imagination, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Days went by, and more strange occurrences followed. The cars kept coming, the men kept visiting, and Laura found herself wondering more and more about Alex and the secretive life he seemed to lead behind closed doors. She wasn't the only one who seemed to be noticing. A few neighbors had mentioned Alex in passing, but none of them knew much about him. No one had ever seen him at neighborhood events, and there were no shared conversations over fences. He was a man of few words, a man of mystery, and as the days turned into weeks, Laura's curiosity began to turn into suspicion. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something hidden beneath the surface of their quiet neighborhood. But what could it be? And more importantly, what was Alex really up to? Laura's suspicion about her neighbor Alex grew with each passing day. The strange visitors to his house, the cars coming and going at odd hours, and the sense of secrecy surrounding him made her increasingly uneasy. She couldn't ignore the growing sense that something was wrong. But what could she do? She wasn't a detective, just a curious neighbor who had started to notice too much. One evening, as Laura was walking her dog around the neighborhood, she noticed something odd. As she passed Alex's house, she saw two unfamiliar men standing near the sidewalk, deep in conversation. They were dressed in dark clothing, their posture tense as they exchanged hurried words. Laura stopped, pretending to tie her dog's leash, but she kept a close eye on them. The men looked out of place, and she couldn't help but feel that they were part of something larger. It wasn't just the men's appearance that bothered her, it was their behavior. They looked over their shoulders constantly, making sure no one was watching. They spoke in hushed tones, and their exchange was brief, almost as if they were trying to avoid being seen or heard. After a few moments, the men separated, walking down the street in different directions. Laura waited a moment before continuing her walk, but the feeling of unease stayed with her. As the days passed, strange things continued to happen. One morning, Laura woke up to find a neighbor's house had been broken into. The police had been called, and there was a lot of talk about stolen jewelry and electronics. It didn't make sense. The neighborhood had always been so safe. But when Laura looked around, something caught her eye. Alex's house, once again, seemed to be at the center of it all. While the police scoured the area for evidence, Laura couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to this break-in than met the eye. The next few days were tense. Laura couldn't stop thinking about the men she had seen near Alex's house and the break-in. She began to connect the dots. The strange visitors, the odd behavior, the men with tattoos she had seen coming and going, they all seemed to be linked to something bigger, something dangerous. Laura tried to speak with a few neighbors about her concerns, but no one seemed to take her seriously. "It's just the way some people are," one neighbor said. "Alex is probably just a private guy." Another shrugged and added, "Maybe he's just having some work done. Who knows?" But Laura couldn't ignore the pattern she had observed. The break-in had been too close, and the strange men, along with their tattoos, were a link to gangs she had read about in the news. She couldn't let it go. Something was off, and she needed to find out what. She started to watch Alex more closely. Every time he left the house, Laura would take note of his movements. Every time a new car arrived, she made sure to watch carefully. She started following him when he left the neighborhood, driving at a distance to avoid being seen. It was risky, but the feeling of dread pushing her forward kept her moving. One night, her persistence paid off. Laura followed Alex as he drove to an area of town she didn't recognize. It was a dark, industrial part of the city, full of abandoned warehouses and run-down buildings. Alex parked in front of one of the warehouses, and Laura watched from a distance as several men emerged from the shadows to meet him. They exchanged brief words before disappearing inside the building. Laura's heart raced. This wasn't just a neighbor with strange habits. This was something more dangerous, and she was now involved in something that could put her in grave danger. Laura's mind raced as she realized the implications of what she had just witnessed. Alex wasn't just a mysterious neighbor. He was tied to something far more sinister. The men, the cars, the late-night visits, it was all beginning to make sense. The warehouse, the secret meetings, the hidden exchanges, they pointed to something far beyond a simple criminal operation. Alex was connected to a gang, a powerful one. The following morning, Laura couldn't focus on anything else. She spent the day searching the internet for any information she could find about local gangs. She came across a news article about a string of robberies, violent confrontations, and other criminal activity in the area. The article mentioned a gang with a leader who had been hard to identify, but everything about it screamed that Alex was involved. But Laura knew she needed more than just research. She had to be sure. She couldn't risk exposing herself or making accusations without evidence. So, she decided to take the next step. She followed Alex again the next day, determined to learn more about his activities. She trailed him through the streets, staying far enough behind to avoid detection. The trail led her to a warehouse once again. But this time, it wasn't just a few men meeting Alex. This time there was a larger group of people. They were unloading large, unmarked packages from the back of a van, passing them to Alex and his associates. It was clear now. This wasn't just a neighborhood issue. It was a full-blown criminal operation. Laura felt her stomach twist as she watched the scene unfold. She knew she was in over her head, but she couldn't turn back. She had uncovered something too big to ignore, and now she had to decide what to do with the information. That night, as Laura sat in her living room, she made a decision. She couldn't go to the police yet, not without proof. So she decided to confront Alex. She would try to get some answers, get him to slip up, to reveal more about what was really happening behind closed doors. The next morning she knocked on his door. The air was thick with tension as Laura stood at Alex's front door. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she knew this was the only way to move forward. She had to confront him, get him to explain himself, or at least give her anything that would help her piece together the truth. When Alex opened the door, he stared at her, his face expressionless. It wasn't a warm greeting, it was cold, calculated. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice flat and emotionless. Laura hesitated for a moment but pushed forward. She tried to keep her voice steady. "I've noticed a lot of strange things happening around here," she said, her words coming out slowly. "The cars, the visitors, people going in and out at odd hours. What's going on?" Alex's eyes narrowed, his gaze sharp and calculating. For a moment he said nothing. Then, without a word, he slammed the door shut. Laura stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. She had expected some form of resistance, but his reaction was more intense than she had imagined. She felt a chill run down her spine. What was he hiding? Later that evening there was a knock at her door. When Laura opened it, there was no one there, but a small piece of paper was left on her doorstep. It was a single sentence: "Stay out of it, or you'll regret it." Laura's stomach twisted. She was scared, but she wasn't backing down. She knew she had uncovered something dangerous. She had to act, even if it meant risking everything. The following days were filled with a sense of dread. Laura didn't know what Alex would do next, but she could sense that she had crossed a line. She began to feel the weight of the danger pressing in on her from every side. Her every move was being watched, but she couldn't stop now. The investigation had only just begun. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and constant anxiety. Laura kept a low profile, staying inside her house whenever possible. She wasn't sure who she could trust anymore. The police had brushed her off when she tried to report the suspicious activity, and Alex was watching her every move. But then, one day, she received a call. It was the police, but this time they had news. They had been tracking Alex for months and had uncovered his entire operation. Alex wasn't just some random neighbor. He was a key figure in a large multi-state gang. The men who had visited his house were part of an illegal network involving drug trafficking, money laundering, and even kidnapping. The missing person she had seen on the flyer. He had been one of Alex's former associates who had tried to turn informant. It turned out that the police had been monitoring Alex's activities for months. They had been waiting for enough evidence to move in, but they hadn't had a breakthrough until Laura had unknowingly tipped the scales. Her observations, her notes, her following Alex, all of it had helped the police crack the case wide open. Laura was stunned. She had never expected her curiosity to lead to such a revelation. The truth was far more sinister than she could have ever imagined. Alex had been operating right under everyone's noses, and no one had suspected a thing. The twist came quickly. Alex, realizing the walls were closing in, had disappeared. The police raided his house, only to find it empty. His criminal empire was crumbling, but Alex was nowhere to be found. As Laura sat in her living room, reflecting on everything that had transpired, she received a final, chilling message from Alex. "I knew you'd figure it out, Laura," it said. "But you're too late." And just like that, the story wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The police may have uncovered the gang, but Alex was still out there, a shadowy figure who knew exactly how to vanish when the time was right. Laura had uncovered a dangerous secret, but the battle was far from over.